Hey everyone, and welcome back to Build UX. In this episode of the CRM Inbox series, we're going to start designing the components for our message detail pane. Looking at our design with where we left off in the last episode, we finished out the message list component. And with that complete, we now need to turn our attention to the message detail pane, which appears when the user clicks on a specific message to read. So it's helpful at this stage to quickly parse our design and think through what additional components we need to create. Right out the gate, I'm noticing that we have these tooltip components, as well as this highlight component and the PDF or attachment preview icons at the bottom here. Other than that, I think pretty much everything that I see in this UI is going to reuse existing components or type specs in some capacity. So diving right in, let's grab this tooltip that we had mocked up here, and let's copy this out so we can start replicating it with more of a component approach. So I'm going to copy this and let's paste it into our atoms page. We have it dropped in here. And now with Control Command plus Alt or Option and G, we're going to create a frame around this tooltip. And let's call this Tooltips Dark. So the first thing I'd like to do is enable a background color. Let's set this to be the main background dark, since we're working on the dark version first. And hitting Control or Command plus Shift, let's add 32 pixels of padding on all sides. We'll move it down and over 32 pixels in each direction to get it centered as a start. All right, so with this neatly arranged in our working space here, we can start recreating this with more of a component setup. So first off, this tooltip plate, let's make sure this has our main background color. And this tooltip caret is also looking good, so we'll want to set that up with the same matching color there. Next, let's dive into the actual tooltip content. So one thing I'm seeing right now is obviously we need to get our type specs and color styles applied, but I think we want one text content box that can resize dynamically to go along with our component sizing. So the first thing I'm going to do is set up our actual typography here. So this first one has body small, it looks like, and it has the high contrast color for the light theme, since we have a light background for this component. Next up, to keep this all in the same text frame, let's just manually add the word designer for this subtitle of sorts. And I believe this will be our micro typography spec. Additionally, let's swap this over to be the medium contrast for the light theme. And it looks like we're going to want to center all of our text in here so we can get that arranged. And let's make sure our text resizing is set to grow vertically. So now we can delete that other piece of text, and let's rename this tooltip content. I'm also going to rename the group itself to be the tooltip. This will be for the dark theme, and it'll be our default variation. I think at this stage we're ready to componentize, and then we'll turn our attention to the layout grid and some of the constraints. So hitting Control or Command plus Alt or Option and K, let's componentize this. And now let's start thinking through some of the constraints of these nested elements. So the first thing is the text I want to scale with the left and right, and also scale with the top and bottom. So that way we have consistent padding or margin around this text content. Let's make sure it's actually centered up in our component so we can grab all of the elements and make sure that they are horizontally aligned to the center. That's looking good in terms of those constraints. The tooltip caret I want pinned to the center and to the top. And lastly, the plate will scale with the left and right and also the top and bottom. So now if we were to drag this around, everything should resize as expected. You can see our text is wrapping if there's not enough available space, which is going to be critical for making this more of a flexible component. So getting that reset, let's actually start working on the sizing constraints that we want to have in place here. So it looks like we have 8 pixels of padding on the top. We want the same on the bottom instead of 5 here. And then I'd like to see 16 on the left and right to align with our sizing grid. So using Control or Command plus the right arrow, let's increase the overall sizing by 2 pixels. And with our text content here, we're going to resize that frame to fit. So now we have 16 pixels of padding on the left and right. The last thing we need to do is increase the plate size, holding Control or Command and the down arrow by 3 pixels. And now we should have that 8 pixels of top and bottom padding and 16 on the left and right. Let's make sure that our actual component frame is resized to fit. And as a last step, let's set up our layout grids to basically show the layout constraints that are in effect here. So we're going to add a new layout grid. The first type is going to be a column. There's only going to be one of those. For the color, we want to go to our local colors and pick that same documentation green we've been using. This will be a stretch column, and the margin will be 16. And the gutter we'll set to 0. So that way we get these nice lines to indicate the left and right bounds. Next up, let's add our vertical padding, and we'll use a row for this. There's only going to be one. We're going to pick that same green as always. It'll be a top row with a height of 8. We're going to offset it by 8 pixels to bring it to the top edge of the plate. And I think the gutter will set to 8 because we want it to have this nice filled appearance. We can actually copy this and paste it. And when we paste it here, we can set it to be bottom and with 0 offset. And this will act as that bottom padding for our layout grid. All right, so this is looking great. Let's go back to our design reference here. So we also have to account for this action variation of a tooltip where we have an icon and it shares that top caret here, but I'm going to think through what we want for this highlighting feature and see if we always want the caret to be on top. So thinking ahead in terms of the highlight functionality that we see here, we have to anticipate all the variations that this can take on and how this tooltip would basically accommodate all of those use cases. So looking at this, we have some smart highlighting that's going on with text that can be converted to reminders within our email body. One consideration here is what happens if this text is really long or comes at the end of a line or needs to wrap to multiple lines. How would we handle that with a tooltip reminder? So one way to figure out how to handle this is to take some design inspiration from other websites that have already solved for this use case. So one website that has solved for this is the narrative.co agency website, and their articles have a highlighting feature built into them that's similar to Medium in terms of being able to share out highlighted text. And you can see that if we highlight text at the beginning of a line, it follows that. If we highlight it at the end of a line, it's obviously centered within that selection. If we do a multi-line selection, however, it centers within the actual text content and appears above in all of these variations. And I think that's probably the best pattern to adapt here. So looking at our original design reference, I think I'm going to flip this caret to be on the bottom, and we'll also want to think through this highlighting component to accommodate all of the different use cases that we might encounter. So keeping this visual reference in mind, let's go back to our atoms page. I'm going to extend out this frame a little bit here. I'm going to drag out a new instance of this original default tooltip component. And I think I'm going to actually detach it because we have enough changes. We want this to stand on its own. So I'm going to rename this to be the action variation of that dark tooltip. The first variation we want to make is to basically rotate this 180 degrees and snap it to the bottom so that still is 8 pixels away from that bottom edge. The next thing I'm going to do is update this text to be add to reminder, and this will only be in the body small content here. Another thing I'd like to do is right align this text so we can accommodate a left icon in just a moment here. We also need to increase the sizing of this component and make sure that everything is constrained as needed. Now that we know our layout constraints are working as expected with the text content, let's get this sized appropriately for a single line of text. So the first thing is I'm going to change the constraints to be center on the text content, and the caret needs to be fixed to the bottom of this component. So now I'm going to bring the height up a bit here, and let's drag this text frame in to be top aligned. We can fine tune things from here. All right, so it looks like that's our appropriate height here. The overall height of this component needs to be resized to fit. And we have to adjust our row positioning as needed. So this top row has an offset of 0, and the bottom row is going to take that offset of 8 pixels. And this is good as a first pass here. So now we want to incorporate an icon variation for that action tooltip. I'm going to go into my assets here, and let's look for our icons. So for the light theme, we look under icons light. We have the small variation and this plus icon. This will be positioned to the left and vertically aligned to the center of this component. Next up, I think I want 16 pixels of margin between the text and the icon. So let's get that incorporated as well. So holding Shift and the right arrow key, I'm going to nudge this 16 pixels and 16 more, so the margin between them is 16. And we have to adjust the width of our component by 32 pixels. So I'm holding Control or Command plus Shift and hitting the right arrow 4 times. Now if we drag our content back in place, you see that everything aligns as expected. We can actually resize this text frame to fit neatly within it. So the last step here is to duplicate our column layout grid and paste it in. And with this one, I would like to set the margin to be 48 to basically show that left edge of the text content. And if we want, we can duplicate this once more and set that margin to be 32. And that'll show the right edge of the icon just to help as a visual aid. With that all complete, we can componentize this using Control or Command plus Alt or Option and K. And everything looks pretty good there. The only other detail I'm noticing here is we want to get our drop shadows established for both the dark and light themes. So right now they just have a manually recreated drop shadow, but let's design this with a little more intention. So one thing we've been doing with all of our drop shadows is having more than one applied to each component to give it more of a realistic visual effect. So this first one, we have a blur of 16 and a Y offset of 4. We want to get this to match the same hex code as our other drop shadows, which I've remembered from just doing this a bunch of times so far, but it's 121217. And I think we'll stick with this opacity of 45. We can disable our layout grids with Control Shift 4 or Command Shift G on Mac. And that might give us a better view at what we're doing. That's pretty subtle, but I think that looks good. So that's that first pass. And then we want to add that secondary drop shadow to add a kind of crisper highlight, create more of a realistic depth effect. So for this one, let's set the blur to be 2, and then maybe try no offset on this one. We'll use that same hex code that we've been using throughout, 121217. And that's looking pretty good. I might want it a little more subtle. I'm going to bump that down to 15%. So with that established, we can add this as a new effect style. So this will be elevation, tooltip, and for the dark theme. Let's go over to our other variation here and get it applied as well. Tooltip dark. And I think that takes care of tooltips for the dark theme. So the last thing here is to get our frame sized appropriately. All right, that's looking good. We need a little bit more height. Perfect. So with that, we can copy our dark tooltips, get them added to the side. Let's rearrange both of these to be the last frames on this particular page. And we'll start working on tooltips for the light theme. So the background color is going to flip to main background light. And you can see that our drop shadows are way too aggressive for the light theme. So that's what we're going to focus on at this stage. And that might actually be the only visual change we need to make. So this should be nice and quick. So we're going to detach this style that we have here. And the first thing, I'd like to bring this opacity down a good bit. So let's see, 5 or 6%. I actually want a little more vertical depth here as well. And on the second one, I think the blur is way too strong. So let's bump that down. And let's play with that Y offset a little bit as well. I think that's helpful to actually have less of a Y offset so that way the caret stands out a little bit further, but it's still looking really aggressive. So let's turn this way down. And I think I set the color of the plate to main background. I should have set that to component background. So it has a little more differentiation there. And I'll do the same for the caret in both of these variations. And with that, they pop off the page a little bit better. So one limitation here is I can't add a box shadow that incorporates the caret as well while still having this resizing. So when it comes time to code this, we'll actually want a box shadow on this top edge as well, just to make that top caret a little more distinctive. But with this new variation added, let's create a new effect style. So this is elevation, tooltip, and this is for the light theme. And we can actually recomponentize this and rename it for the light variation. Last thing, we'll want to swap this from tooltip dark to tooltip light. That's looking good. And rename this component as we recomponentize it. All right, and if we ever want, we can finesse these a little further to work better for our use case, but I think this is a good first pass. Next up, let's tackle another component that we'll need to build, and that's this highlight component that gets auto-generated based on any important reminders that might appear in this email body. So I'm going to copy this first draft out, and this will also be a design atom. Drag out frame, rename this to highlights dark, and set that main background dark color. All right, so the first variation is everything neatly fitting within one line of text. In other words, imagine if we only had, say, the center of our sentence or line highlighted. So for our first variation, let's just stick with this start and end point being on the same line of text. So the first thing is let's open up these original layers here. And we have a border radius of 6. I'm going to try to nudge this down to 4. And to stick with our 8-pixel spacing grid, let's adjust the height to 24. This bottom border is looking good. Let's make sure our plate actually has the highlight colors that we selected earlier. So we have our highlight background. And both the text and the border will share the highlight text color. So let's grab that. Get that applied to make sure we have enough contrast, and do the same for that border. The last thing I'm seeing is we currently have only 13 pixel font size, which is way too small. So if we go back to our typography, I think we wanted the body default sizing for all of our email text. So that way everything is nice and legible. Obviously, this really exceeds the original sizing of this component, so we can adjust things as needed here. The first thing I'm going to do is vertically align that text, and I might actually detach this text style just so the line height matches the height of the text itself. And with that, we can adjust our sizing as needed. I think I want it to be 4 pixels from the top and bottom, as well as the left and right. We can adjust our plate as needed. And that bottom border should align left and right with the same edges as the text. And we have a 2-pixel gap between the text and this bottom border. All right, so that sizing is looking really good. Let's rename this to be highlight. This is a single line variation, and for the dark theme. Let's go through and remove the word message from each of these nested elements. All right, with that, I think we're ready to componentize. So Control or Command plus Alt or Option and K, and let's start establishing our layout constraints. So the text I want left and right and center. Same with this border. And the plate, scale with the left and right and be centered as well. So if we adjust the sizing, you'll see the text wrap and the border fits as needed. And that's exactly what we're looking for. Lastly, let's add some layout grids to document our spacing. So we'll have a column. There's only going to be one. We'll select our layout green. It'll be a stretch column with a margin of 4 and a gutter of 0. Okay, I'm going to copy this and paste it and modify the second one to be a row instead. And that's a quick way to get the same side padding as your vertical padding. Cool, so that variation is looking good. We can drag out an instance of this and account for some of the other use cases we might encounter. So I'll drag our frame out a little bit to give us more room to work with. Now the next variation I'm thinking about is if we're highlighting something in a multi-line situation and it comes at the end of a line. So we want to account for that kind of start point and also think through maybe a midpoint and an end point for a multi-line highlight. So for example, in this situation, we have a start variation, a mid variation, and an end variation as well. And if we look, we have this border radius that we want to retain, so we have to create visual variations for each of those. So because so much is going to vary, we're going to need to detach this instance, and we'll call it multi-line instead. And this will be the multi-line start. So with this, we actually want the border radius to only be applied to the top left as well as the bottom left. So these middle inputs we can set to 0. That creates a sharp border on the right side of our component. Next up, let's kind of mock up some text. So we'll just have meeting as that first word of the highlight. And from here, we want all of our sizing to be reduced down so that it just neatly fits on that single line. And one other thing I think I want is for the text and the border to go all the way to that right edge. And with that, we can adjust our layout grid to reflect that there's no right padding. So this will be a left column, be a width of 4 and an offset of 0. So with that layout grid updated, that's now looking accurate, and we can componentize this new variation. The next variation we want is if text is spanning a full line of a highlight, so this middle line variation here, where we have no border radius on either side. So duplicating this once further, drag this down. We're going to detach this instance again. This will be the multi-line middle. In this case, the text frame is going to go edge to edge. There is no border radius on anything. Our border is going to extend all the way to the edges as well. And we won't actually need a column layout grid at all. So I'm going to say that this text is going to be tomorrow at, just to match what we have in this single line variation. And let's make sure everything fits by resizing our component. So that's looking good. We want this to be centered as needed, and everything's looking great. So we can componentize this. And the last variation is kind of that end point of our highlight. Or in other words, this last segment of text here, which will have border radius just on the right side. So this will be multi-line end. I'm going to detach this instance with Control Command plus Alt or Option and B. And we want that border radius on the right side of our component, as well as that 4 pixels of padding. So I reduced the width of this down by 4 pixels. Let's just have a little bit longer text, just as an example. We can reduce our bottom border width as well. And let's make sure that we have enough room for our text with the component frame sizing. There we go. Last thing we need to do is add a column layout. So we'll copy our row, switch this to columns, and it'll be a right column with a width of 4, offset of 0. Get that componentized as well. That's looking good. So now we have all of these different use cases accounted for. So we have the single line variation and multi-line components with any combination that we need. So if it's 3 lines or more, we have the middle, start and end points, or we could just use start and end points as well. All right, so with that taken care of, let's copy this over one more time, and we're going to update each of these for the light variation. Rename the frame to highlights light. And I want to collapse down all these layers, so I can actually just use Alt or Option plus L to accomplish that. Drag these to the bottom and get things rearranged. This frame background is main background light, and this theming looks pretty harsh for a light theme, so let's change the background color. I think I want something that is offset just for the light theme a bit. So let's maybe do elevation background to end. That looks pretty good. Let's get our text to be the medium contrast for the light theme, as well as that bottom border. And that looks pretty good. So I'll recomponentize this and rename it for the light theme. I'm going to go through quickly and update the rest here. All right, with those completed, we have a good head start on the components we'll need for our message detail pane. This is a good place to stop for this episode. In the next episode, we'll tackle these attachment preview icons and then start scaffolding out all of the remaining elements of the message details. Should be quick because we have the existing components and type specs, so a lot of that will just be rapid layout and sizing of components. Thank you so much for watching, and be sure to check out the next episode.